All right. Good morning, everyone. This is Mike Dane with MLS Technology. I think we might actually have everybody here that we were anticipating, so just going to go ahead and run through some of the basic stuff real quick. So for those of you guys who have been through our webinars before, I know this is kind of always rehashing something that you guys are probably very familiar with at this point, but you're going to be starting on mute by default. What that means is that you guys will end up having the option to get unmuted a little bit later. I'll show you guys how to do that in just a moment here. We also have a Q&A button. This is where you guys can write down any questions that you have. It is going to be just text, but please make sure that you funnel any of your questions into that Q&A section. The chat option doesn't really give me too much of a notification whenever something gets added to it, but the Q&A is a little bit more obvious. And I can also leave the questions open so that if we end up having something that we're going to be addressing soon, or whatever the case may be, we can get to it when we can. Also, I wanted to mention in that chat section, you can put in any comments, examples. A little bit later here, we're going to have an option to take a specific property that one of you has, and we can take a look at that. So if you guys have any information that you'd like to pass along that's not a question, funnel that into the chat section. Now the session will be recorded. I'll be sending you guys a link after the class is over. And I also wanted to let you guys know, since this is a CE credit class, we want to ensure that everybody's able to get their credit. And what that means is that we need to make sure if you guys are having audio or video issues, we're made aware immediately. So if you guys have any problems with the session staying connected, or the audio isn't coming through properly, or the video cuts out, or anything at all, just let us know. If you can't do it in chat or Q&A or hit the raise hand button, just give us a call over at the service desk and let us know so that we can at least have it documented. We can find out what we can do to help. All right. Finally, the CE credit will be sent off to our education director right after class is over, when we get the attendance report done. And then we'll be sending that on to OREC pretty quickly short after that. But you guys should see that information added to your credit on OREC's side, usually by the end of the month. Sometimes it may take a little bit longer, but we always end up sending that stuff off pretty quickly. It's just usually a matter of making sure that it's actually applied to your account, or your license, excuse me. All right. So the buttons that you guys have on the screen, we've got the chat option, Q&A, and then the third option is actually raise hand. Now this is one that we're going to be using if you have a question you would like to ask with your voice. I mentioned before that there's an option to allow you to get unmuted. It's that raise hand option. So if you guys have a question that you would like to ask, and it's maybe either a little too complicated, or if you guys are joining us on a mobile device especially, this may end up being especially important. Tap the screen and you can find those same three buttons. But if you just want to ask your question with your voice instead of having to type it all out, maybe it's complicated, maybe it's going to require some nuance, just hit that raise hand button. I'll get you unmuted and we can help you out. All right. Well, that's it for now. Let me get this out of the way. Let's start talking about RPR. Oh, and actually, before we officially get started with class, I did want to mention we are going to be taking a 10-minute break at the top of the hour. So it's not just going to be me talking for 2 hours straight, so not to worry. We'll have a little bit of a break there. Immediately after that, though, we will be doing a little participation check, so make sure that you're returning back on time, but we'll mention that again later. All right, it's 9:05. I'm going to go ahead and launch our poll. This is going to be used as justification whenever we send off the CE credit. So we do require that everyone participate in that poll. It's just asking if you're new to real estate and if you have already used RPR. So fairly simple. And again, in order to get the CE credit, I'm going to need everybody to participate in that. All right. Make sure. We should be set. Okay, perfect. All right, we're all set. So it looks like we've got a couple of you guys who are not new to real estate and one who is relatively new. Oh, and then oddly enough, the reverse for the RPR. One of you guys has used it and the other two have not. So not a big deal. We can work with that. And let's close out of that. All right. So RPR is actually a little link that you guys have here on the main page. So whenever you guys get signed in to the MLS for the first time, you land here on the MLS portal. There's going to be a link here for RPR. Now, RPR is the Realtor Property Resource. When you click on this, there may be some initial registration that you'll have to go through. It's all going to be related directly to your National Association of Realtors license and account information, your email, everything else. It's all going to be the stuff that you have with your official realtor license. RPR is actually going to be a member benefit of the National Association of Realtors, which means even if you guys do end up changing over to a different MLS at some point in time, you'll always still have access to RPR as long as you're a licensed realtor. Now, another thing I wanted to mention specifically about the Realtor Property Resource, which is what RPR stands for. The Realtor Property Resource is actually a wholly owned subsidiary corporation of NAR. So if you guys are kind of trying to get a gauge on how closely this is connected to NAR, this is actually something that they own. This is a product that they offer through their membership and only to those people that are members of the National Association. Now, to that end, they do actually limit the access to this. So in order for you to even gain the ability to get into this system, you have to have had their membership, and it's only going to be able to be signed into by people who are either licensed realtors or their assistants, which I'll show you guys in a bit here. If you guys have an assistant, we can talk about how to get them into this in case they need to run reports or do prospecting, et cetera, et cetera. So another thing that we wanted to mention, and this is actually something that I've gotten to witness happen even in my short time here, RPR actually goes through a lot of changes as far as what their features are. So they don't end up taking away a lot of stuff, and they're certainly not going to go through any kind of like rehashing all of the interface or changing how things are laid out or anything like that. They actually did that a couple of years ago. It was subtle. It added a bunch of new features, and that was about it. But they're always trying to refine it. They're always trying to add in new features and functions. In fact, actually, the investor analysis option, the opportunity zones, even the prospecting has all been added in the last couple of years. So they're constantly trying to make this more useful, more valuable to you as realtors. Now, part of the reason why they keep on trying to make sure that this is actually something that's of value, and again, is only going to be accessible to realtors, is because the idea behind the Realtor Property Resource is that this is going to be allowing you to be the lightning rod, the singular lightning rod for any question that a client might have. So for instance, if you guys end up having someone contact you about property that's maybe not listed, you guys can find that information. The entire country's properties are all found in this app. So if you guys end up needing to find property, maybe there's a listing for one of your buyers. They've got their property that they're selling out some other state and it's a part of some MLS. You can look up that listing data through RPR. We're going to talk about some of the limitations that has a little bit later. So that's not universally true, but all of the properties in the entire country are going to be available. Uh, it's just going to be the listing data. They may be limited, but we'll discuss that in a bit. Another cool thing about RPR is that whenever you do end up finding a property that you're interested in, there's going to be data that's coming from over 350 different sources in order to compile all of that information into one location for you so that you can actually be, again, that lightning rod for any questions that a client might have. If they're wondering about, when it was built or some simple stuff like that, like you can check your tax record information for it. But this is going to expand on that information by providing you proprietary stuff like the AARP livability index. It's going to be providing some things that may have actually come over directly from the listing data. There's a lot of information that'll come in just about the property itself, but then you'll also be able to see a history of the area, some charts relating to the market in the area. There's even some ways that you guys can narrow down into exactly what the price should be for this property. And then of course, there's also a neighborhood chart that allows us to see a kind of an overhead view of the entire area that this property is located in. Fortunately for Oklahoma, we don't have a lot of codified neighborhoods that are really consistent. So most everything is going to be narrowed down by the zip code, but that neighborhood chart is actually, or neighborhood report is actually very valuable. We'll talk about that a little bit more later in class. All right, so a couple of important notes about what RPR does not do. RPR, I mean, again, it's a wholly owned subsidiary or corporation of NAR, but what that means is that they also are not going to try and get involved in any of the MLS side of things. So this is actually where MLS data terminates. We don't have anything that's going to be automatic or that's going to be put into the RPR system that didn't pass through an MLS at some point in time, but they also are not an MLS themselves. So what that means is that people aren't circumventing the cooperation and collaboration that it's offered through an MLS and putting their listings directly into RPR. It all has to go through an MLS first. I also wanted to point out that since this is an endpoint for that listing data, you don't have to worry about some listing that you guys entered in the MLS going to RPR and then subsequently going somewhere else. They are not a listing syndicator. They don't redistribute any listing data. This is just where the data comes to get aggregated in with a bunch of other sources of information. Now, we're going to be discussing a lot of different, more practical views of how to actually use RPR. Today, we're going to be focusing in on how to help buyers and sellers. So the initial portion of class, we're going to be talking about how to work with buyers. And the latter portion of class, we're going to be talking about how to work with sellers. But RPR can be used for a variety of different things, as we'll see today. You can use this just to research property details, like I mentioned already. You can also use this to try and comp out a particular property, find out what the specifications are, make sure that you have all the accurate information, and come up with a solid pricing estimate for your client. We also have the ability, as you guys saw up in here, shortcuts. We can do prospecting, investor analysis. There's these opportunity zones that'll allow you guys to kind of zone in on a specific area that might have a lot of opportunities for people to sell their properties, make a good amount of money. They also give you guys the option to create very, very good reports. This is one of the things that actually initially drew me to RPR was that whenever you guys first get in here, you can find properties and kind of explore it just like you would any other website where you can search for properties. But one of the big things that they allow you to do is create these extremely comprehensive reports. We're going to be discussing the reports a lot more a little bit later in class. But before we get into any of that more practical stuff, as far as actually how to use the system, we need to make sure that everything is ready before we actually start creating reports or sending things off to people. So up here at the top right corner, there's going to be a little icon. This is where we're going to get into something that you might need to follow along with. So if you do have the app open at the same time, or if you guys are signed into RPR, or even if you're just watching the recording and doing this, follow along with this because we're going to do some practical things first. So click on the little drop down to the right of your profile and click on the word profile. Now, at the moment, mine actually already has an image put in there. And that's because whenever I got into my profile the first time, I changed my photo and uploaded a photo of myself. If you guys notice, there's just a little basic profile icon. You guys can actually go in there and put in a photo of yourself just to make sure that it's in there. Uh, as always, just a good reminder for those of you guys who have been doing this for a while, or maybe you're relatively new, uh, all of the branding should be consistent no matter where you guys are presenting your information. There was a study that they had done a while ago that showed that if you guys see the exact same face and the same information a certain number of times, you're more likely to remember it. So what that means is that whenever you guys are seeing the exact same headshot, whenever you guys are seeing the exact same spelling of your name or the same logo next to your photo, all of that information is going to get stuck in people's brains just due to the repetition. So even though it might be nice to try and have like a different headshot or a different image of yourself, always make sure that you guys have a fresh one that gets put everywhere that you have your face, so that you always have the exact same image so that people are more likely to remember you, because that's pretty much the biggest and most important thing with real estate is how much people remember you. A little further down, you're going to find your office contact information. So the address and then some contact information down here for either yourself or your office, depending on how the membership data moved over. In my case, my office was what moved over. There is also the option to add in more forms of contact. So if you guys have a fax number or a pager, or if you guys are just in general living in 1999 still because you're using a fax and a pager, just make sure that all of that information is put in there. The details that you guys update on all of this profile documentation is going to be added on to any of the reports that you create. So make sure that this is all up to date and that it's directing people towards where you can be reached. A little bit further down, we have the MLS or CIE info. So the MLS side of things, you guys are probably fairly familiar with. CIE, for the uninitiated, is actually a commercial information exchange. It's effectively an MLS that's specifically for commercial properties instead. So commercial sales, commercial leasing. Anyway, this MLS or CIE info page or section is actually going to show you what MLSs you're connected to. There are some MLSs that are actually not sharing their data. We happen to be sharing a lot of information. So this means that we're showing not only just the stuff that's on market, but also the stuff that's off market. And we make that available to everyone. There are some MLSs in the state that actually are not sharing that kind of information or even just not sharing any information at all. But if you guys need to find out and you are part of that other MLS or CIE, you can go down to Oklahoma for your state and see all of the different MLSs that you can become or that you can connect yourself to. Now, interestingly enough, there are some that actually are not sharing information that are pretty close to us, unfortunately. We've got properties in over 38 counties. This just happens to be the counties that we happen to cover right now. But if we switch this over to all MLSs, you can see we've got North Central, Northeast, Northwest, and the Stillwater Board are actually not sharing their on-market listings. So you may notice this is kind of a dead zone of listings, not only in our MLS or even Data Co-op, but also in RPR, because they just have decided that this is not going to be beneficial for them to share it with RPR. I know that there's probably some perfectly sound logic behind that. It does kind of funnel people more towards trying to find someone in that area to work with rather than actually just having a realtor from anywhere be able to track down any of those listings. So maybe it's beneficial for the people there, but also makes it harder to do comps and a lot of other things. So if any of you guys have any sway or influence over any of those boards that are not sharing that data, you may want to discuss that with them to see if they might be able to turn the switch on for that. But anyway, a little further down, after you guys have added in your MLS information, you can also add in any of your license information. Just to be clear and explicit with this, I do not have a real estate license. Legally, I can't. So mine is blank here. But finally, we get down to our assistant users section. This is something that I mentioned a little bit earlier, but you do have the option to actually connect your account to an assistant. So for instance, if you are someone who has maybe that person in the office that's helping you out with printing flyers or labels or doing prospecting, or want to, just have somebody fire off a report to a client real quick, you can set them up as an assistant user down here. But I did want to make it very clear to you guys, this is not meant to allow someone who is not a realtor or not an unlicensed assistant access to the system. There is a vast amount of information that's going to be specific to MLSs and proprietary information, or even just confidential information that's only meant to be shown to realtors and the licensed realtors. So any of these unlicensed assistants are going to have come through the MLS or whatever system that you guys are using to ensure that this is not somebody who's not supposed to access this. So just make sure that this is a legitimate usage. But after that, you're all set. Up at the top right of this, we do have the option to verify our information, change our password, or even see what apps we have. So for right now, I've actually got it installed on a couple of phones and an iPad, but easy peasy. If you do end up making any changes, make sure to come back up to the top and save it. Now, there is another section over here called settings. If you guys are fairly certain that all of your profile information is up to date, you can also access this by clicking on your menu button up at the top right and hit settings here. But here we can actually see some of the settings for how things are going to show up in the map and showing up for search results. Now, the new tag is actually going to be something that you guys get to choose which listings are actually considered new or not. So for instance, right now, the market is pretty hopping. A new listing is actually 3 days or more, or 3 days or younger. If I end up setting this to 7 days or less, it's going to seem like the entire market is all new listings. If I switch it all the way to the maximum amount, I mean, there's hardly anything that's not going to be a new listing at that point. So you may want to adjust this based on what the market is doing, or at least what the market is doing in your area. And then the same thing goes for the recently sold or leased. This is going to define how many of those properties are actually going to show up on the map. So if you guys want to see the last 6 months of data, cool. If you don't, and you only want to see maybe just the last 30 days worth of information, because that's, again, with the market being what it is right now, setting this to the last 6 months of information is going to show you thousands of results. That's just going to be cumbersome. So the last 30 days might be a little bit more realistic. Now you do have separate sections, one for residential, one for commercial, so make sure to set those appropriately if you happen to work in both. But let's move over here to the My Markets section. Now you may have noticed that map that I was kind of lingering around whenever we were initially looking at the homepage. It actually has a bunch of options there where we can choose from a map or choose from the property, or the cities, in order to be able to find what properties are either currently available or have recently sold, again, according to this options over here to the right. In my case, what I did is I actually set up all of the locations that we go out to do training in. So if you guys are maybe in one of these areas and not near Tulsa, so we are going to be starting up with the in-person classes again soon. We are going to try and get back to doing outreach as well. It's just we are currently trying to hire a new outreach trainer. If you guys happen to know anybody, send them our way. That'd be great. But in the interim, I've added all of these cities on here. This is just to make sure that I can quickly and easily access what's happening in that particular area. Now, this may seem like a familiar tool. I can actually head back to my home page, save changes. And we can see I've got it set for Tulsa right now. And if I scroll down on this list, I can see the other I can see the other options on here. We've got Bartlesville. If I click on Bartlesville, it'll now show me all of the properties that are currently for sale there, as well as if I switch this over to closed, I can see the properties that have closed within the last 30 days. Again, each of these is effectively just producing a map version of the hot sheets. So if you guys have been using that in Matrix, we've got the Market Watch section, which has the numbers, the same way that we do here. And then we also have the hot sheets, which allows us to quickly jump into maybe a specific area. And then I can check out the map and see what's happening with it. So I can quickly and easily do that. Or I can just jump into RPR, click on Durant. It shows me my numbers as well as putting everything on the map for me. So it's just a little bit easier to use. I like the visual as well. This just makes it a little bit easier for me to understand what's happening and where things are actually physically located. All right. So let's now talk a little bit more about our homepage. So beyond just making sure that you have your list with all of the options, which you can even click add or edit here, and that'll bring you back to that same page that we were just looking at. We have a little further down a section here for my listings. This is going to automatically check what listings are active in Matrix and then subsequently populate this list with those properties. It's also going to have a section here for my properties. So as you're going through in the system, you're going to notice that there's a little heart icon. So whenever you end up finding something of interest, you can save that, and that'll actually appear under this saved properties, as well as the My Work section, which is just another quick and easy way to access all of the same things you have here on the homepage. The saved properties are going to either be coming in with just the property's name, like this one that I just added just now. It's just showing the property's address. We also have the option when you're looking at a property a little bit more closely. So like if I click on one, click view details, when you save it as a favorite here, you have the option to give it a name. If you guys would like to save it with, this is their dream property, or that's the property that they were interested in, however you want to refer to it, your naming conventions can be entirely your own. So like this one, I just named after the owners. This one I named after the buyers that are interested in this property. You can save it for a variety of reasons. We also have the option to see any of the properties that we've recently clicked on. So one of the cool things about RPR is that it keeps track of everything that you've been doing. So while you guys are actually looking at a specific property, it'll keep track of when it was and where it was that you did that, so that you can just quickly jump back into it later if need be. It's also important to notice that we have a little icon over to the left of whatever the property was you were looking at, indicating what device you were on. This is another way for us to quickly delineate between, all right, this is something that I just looked at today, or here's something that I was actually looking at out on the road the other day. So I was on my phone, and you can see that little phone icon. Further, we've got the reports option. And the reports is really nice because you can actually see, got neighborhood reports, property reports, sellers reports. There's a variety of different reports that we have access to. And what's even better about the reports is that you can produce those even when you're out on the road. So whenever we were looking at my profile information, you saw that I had a couple of devices that have an app installed on them. And that app is actually going to be the RPR app that allows us to effectively do all the same stuff that we were doing here. Everything that we're going to be covering in class today is available on mobile as well. So it's really cool. We'll talk about those a bunch a little bit later though. Finally, we have a notes section. So interestingly enough, whenever we're actually looking at a specific property, there's a bunch of different sections where we can add in additional notes. So for instance, if I'm going through and I see on the description, I wanted to add a little bit more clarity, I can click that plus and find a little space here for me to type in extra information. We can choose whether or not we want to include that on reports as well. So for instance, if I was preparing a report for a buyer and I wanted to add some more clarity to what the area is or what the description is of the property, or even down here where we can see all of the different notes about how many or what the size of the property is, or how many rooms, bathrooms, et cetera. We can even add more rows, or we can just come down here to the bottom and just add in more notes about the amenities of the property. There's a whole bunch of different places for that, but there's also going to be a section that's just kind of overarching. This is going to be the My Updates section over here on the right of the property. And it shows notes where we can add in any notes that we want, photos where we can upload photos of this property, and we can even prepare a seller's proceeds sheet by just clicking Add Seller's Proceeds. When you guys are on the mobile device, there's even an extra added benefit. When you're looking at the mobile app, when you're looking at a property on the mobile app, you'll have the option to add in voice recordings as well. So rather than just hoping that you can type everything out, especially if you guys are working on a tiny keyboard on your phone, it might actually be better just to hit that record option and then just transcribe it later, because when you get back to your office, open up that property on RPR, you'll be able to see all of those notes that you've added, including any of the photos that you've taken or any of the voice recordings you've made. So it's really a great function, strongly recommended. But I'm going to head back to my homepage one more time. This notes option, again, that's going to be found under my work, my notes, or on the homepage here, notes, and we can just jump back into a specific spot and see all of the information. So really handy. Anyway, heading back to our homepage. So that's it for our review of the homepage. Let's now talk about oh, actually, perfect, it's 9:30. We're going to talk now about the working with a buyer side of things. So what we're looking at in this case is going to be the properties that are currently for sale. So on the homepage of RPR, we have the toggle between residential and commercial. We've got a location search, and then a bunch of the basic filters here. Now, when we're going through here to actually search for a specific area, we can type in, let's just do Littleton, Colorado. And you notice how what it's doing is it's offering a place that we can use. And whenever we click on this place, it's just going to immediately take whatever the other filter options are and just start the search for you. So if you guys wanted to, oh my gosh, if I can spell properly, there we go. So Eufaula, if I click on Eufaula, Oklahoma, what it's going to do is just immediately jump me into that search. So I didn't actually get the opportunity to put in my filters quite yet, but we can always go back after the fact and do that. So if I wanted to clarify this further, I only want to see the things that are for lease. I only want to see the things that are single family. Oh, and actually, by the way, here's lot and farm or ranch. I only want to see things that are between a certain price. So let's say, I'm going to just do 200 to 300,000. Perfect. I also have the option, which I truly appreciate this about any app that allows me to do this. If we're working with a specific budget, I can start typing and it'll automatically offer me some options that are relevant. I don't know if you guys have worked in any systems before where they have unusual restrictions on what fields you can actually enter text into. We used to have something that we offered that was called Find, and then it got refreshed and it was called Realtor.com Professional Search, which is what it is now. But when they initially started, the drop downs that they had were just $100,000 range. There was no nuance to it whatsoever. And of course, you couldn't type in anything either. Literally, it was just use that drop down or don't use anything. But with this, we can actually manually type in a price. We also have the option to just put in one or the other. So for instance, if I just knew my clients had a hardline budget of 300,000, but they didn't necessarily care if there was some property that they found that was like a little bit of a fixer-upper, so maybe it's all right if it's, $100,000 or something like that. Cool. If I don't put in a minimum, it's just going to automatically check for the maximum. If I instead put in a minimum and leave the max open-ended, it does the exact opposite. So we'll be starting with 300,000 and it'll only show properties that are that or up. We also have, as you guys can see here, a total value of the property, living value versus the square footage. So this is actually specifically referring to the square foot of the livable space. That's why it says living. So this is the price per square foot option that we see in Matrix. We also have a lot size that's going to be broken down either into square feet or acres. So depending on how large that property is, or if you guys want a little bit more clarity to it, you can use either or on that. Right. The bedroom count works pretty much the exact same way. We've got a min and max. You can put in 3. I'm going to do 3, 3. Actually, let's do 4 and 3. All right. So we've got some basic information put in here. I've already got my location added, so I can just do my search. And this time, we're going to only be seeing the results that match these filters. Now, all of that's fairly simple, especially if you guys have spent any amount of time shopping on the internet over, I don't know, the last 2 decades. So I'm going to hit this filters option, and we're going to take a look at some of the other filter choices that we have available. So we see that whenever we click on that filters button, the type and status is actually now its own section. Same thing with property type, same thing with price, and of course, bedrooms and bathrooms as well. But we're also getting some additional options. So we have a price to estimated value. And this is one of the things that I think is relatively underutilized. What this is allowing us to do is check what is the price of the property according to the listing agent versus what is the estimated value of the property in order to validate that maybe this is in fact actually a really good deal for my client. Like you guys saw earlier, or maybe noticed, there was a property that we were looking at that was like 850,000, but the estimated value for that property was 2 million. So what that would mean is that I'm going to be taking a look at the price to estimated value. We would want to just kind of play with this range to see if we can find either a really good deal for my client or maybe see what might be a little bit overestimated on the value. We also have a section here for checking the size, and this was where we found bed and bath, but we also have living area or lot size, again, broken down by square feet or acres. We can choose whether or not we want to include or not any of the pre-foreclosure, foreclosure, or just a foreclosed property. If you guys don't want any of the foreclosure statuses, you can hit this exclude all, which looks like it left the same amount of properties, so I'm still at the same. We also have the option to search by open houses. If you guys would like to, this isn't something that necessarily is very commonly filled out in Matrix. But if you guys do end up having any properties that are having open houses, you can put those into Matrix under your listing. And this will make sure that whenever somebody's actually trying to find that property, they can actually go out to an open house. A lot of systems actually receive that data directly from Matrix, including, obviously, RPR. We also have, for those of you guys who are working with vacant land, a little section here to define what the land use is going to be. It's a very, 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 very long list. So just be really cognizant of that search function up at the top. Finally, we have our miscellaneous fields and our keyword search. Miscellaneous fields allows us to search for a specific owner, what the year built was, how long they've actually owned the property, which was an interesting feature. And then we also have this keyword search. Now, for those of you guys who haven't worked with RPR before, this keyword search is going to be a godsend. This is actually going to allow you to run a search that's almost as comprehensive as what you guys have access to in Matrix. Because as you guys are probably painfully aware with Matrix, there is a lot of different things that you guys can search for in there. And there's even extra fields that you guys can add if you need to augment whatever the basic search functions are. So in RPR, instead of having a whole bunch of codified fields that you guys would have to search for, and then making, obviously, this relatively open, very easy to read text get a little bit cluttered, they decided instead, let's just do a keyword search. So this way, instead of having to worry about all of the random stuff that you might have to type in or finding the right field to check whether there's gated access, you can just type that information in here. So my favorite example is mature trees. If I type in mature, hit enter, there we go. Now I got a keyword and 0. So none of these properties have mature trees or are mentioning mature trees. Let's see if any of them have a 3-car garage. None, okay. Well, 2-car garage? None, interesting. This one for sure has a garage. That one looks like it does as well. They may not have mentioned that on their listings then, but either way, this is an easy feature. You guys can add any of these pre-built ones or just type something in up at the top here. All right, so I'm going to hit update and search, and it provides me with 5 results. Now, when we're looking at our results page, there's a couple different ways for this information to appear. If we had searched for just one specific property, like we're going to do a little bit later in class with our seller, then in that case, we can just jump directly into that property's listing data. If we end up searching for a location or an area, we're going to end up finding a search results page that looks like this, where we can see the small preview of the listing photos. And then there's a button over here to the right that allows us to switch over to a photo grid view. This allows us to see those a little bit closer and even scroll between them. And then we also have the map view. So if you guys wanted to double check where things are physically located, this will allow you guys to actually see that. Zoom in, zoom out. There's a bunch of map features we're going to talk about in a bit here. ADU. Let me double check. Oh, that's right. I need to actually run my search. Since I just got out of that search, let me jump back into it. Let's take a look at that filter. You said ADU. Oh, I've never actually seen that before. Or I guess I should say I've never noticed it before. ADU. Accessory dwelling unit. Huh. It's interesting. Well, I just learned something new. That's really interesting. Well, so I guess if you guys wanted to have a property that you lived in, but also had space for someone else to live, but separately, I guess that'd be your option. That's really cool. Anyway, okay. So when you're looking at your search results, again, you can switch between any of those different views, but the end point is always going to be trying to find out more about a particular property. So as soon as you click on either the photo or the listing data or whatever you click on, it's going to pull you into the property's details. Now, we've already seen a couple of these as time has gone on. So I'm going to just kind of scroll down here to the property summary first. So beyond all of the basic information that we have access to, there's a section here called property summary that kind of gathers up a lot of the basic information that you might need to know. And then it also provides us with the current list price, if it's an active property, and then also an RVM. Now, the AVM is actually something that you guys might have been exposed to a bunch already. That's the automated valuation model. What that means is that whenever you guys are actually looking at a property's value that the system has created for you, it's using an algorithm that checks any of the similar properties in the vicinity, what the market conditions are like, but it's all going to be based off of just publicly accessible information. So that means only the tax records are actually going to be used for this. Now, that's typically not a problem. In fact, actually, more often than not, that's actually going to be a pretty good estimation of what the value should be. But that's also going to be relying only on the properties that are currently sold. So that means that we don't see what the value is on the market immediately, whereas this RVM is actually specifically referring to the realtor valuation model. Notice it's got a little registered trademark thing after this. This is the realtor valuation model that's produced here. Now, what the RVM is actually including is it takes all of the same information that the AVM would have, but if the market is populated enough with listing data in the MLS, it'll also be able to take in the public record data and augment it with that fresh listing data. So rather than having to wait until a property sells before we can actually find out what the true value of another property is, we can actually just look at the market in general and see what's active currently. So that's another big reason why I think that MLS is not participating in the RPR system or syndicating their data or whatever the case may be, is kind of shooting themselves in the foot, because there are a lot of tools that they could be using that just won't have access to the market information in that area. But anyway, a little further down, we also have the explanation of the RVM. Now, the RVM range here, so the estimated range, is a relatively narrow focus on this particular property. So notice this is only around what is that, 40,000, 35,000 in difference. So about a 10% difference. And in fact, that's actually what this RVM confidence is directly referring to. So that 5-star confidence score is indicating to us that this is a property that has a substantial amount of information to back that particular number that they provided. So that 5 stars, at least on the back end, is indicating they expect that this property is going to be within 10% of the value of the estimate 90% of the time. Now, I know that kind of sounds like that Anchorman movie where they're like 60% of the time it works every time. But in this case, it's just trying to indicate that they have confidence that that range that they provided is really narrow and that it's going to be relatively close to that when it sells. But they're also leaving that extra 10% of leeway just in case property ends up selling in bulk, or if it has a bunch of other properties that are in the area that are actually similar in specifications, but not similar in location. Like I've noticed, at least for those of you guys who might be working with lakefront property, which is why I used Eufaula as an example. If you have a property that actually is on the lake and it has the exact same specifications of a property that's, I don't know, half a mile away from the lake, well, if it's within half a mile, lenders are going to think that that's technically a comparable property. But as we know in the real estate industry, location, location, location. If it's on the waterfront, that's going to add a dramatic amount of money to the value of the property. So you may end up noticing that the system can't quite see all of those details and subsequently not provide us with an exactly accurate number. But for the majority of the time, if you guys are seeing an AVM put in there, there's a pretty good likelihood that's going to be a useful estimate. But if you guys see that it's providing an RVM, and especially an RVM that has such a high confidence score, there's a very good likelihood that that number is going to be pretty accurate. And in fact, from what it appears, it looks like Natalie Tracy ended up putting almost exactly the same amount as what the RVM estimate is, just kind of rounded up a little bit. It also shows that the estimated range that we were provided, hers falls pretty much smack dab in the middle of that. So seems like we can pretty confidently say that this is the value that we should be shooting for if we were trying to sell this or if we were trying to get a buyer arranged for this. All right. Oh, that's unfortunate. The guy's name is John McLean. Christmases are really tough for him. It's all the vents and ducts that he has to crawl through. I'm glad he got remarried. Anyway. Die Hard is the greatest Christmas movie ever. Just full facts. A little bit further down. Oh, a couple important notes. Whenever you guys are looking at this property summary, we're going to talk a little bit more about the charts and everything else when we get to the seller side of things. But for the buyer side of things, we're just going to take a quick look at this property summary page and then jump over to the neighborhood side. But on this summary page, we do have a section here for schools. It's important to note that the schools that are being referenced here are either going to be coming based from the listing or based on the proximity. So whenever you guys see this broken down into the two different categories, the one on the left is going to be the listing data that the MLS listing has. So this is what the agent had actually provided to us. And then on the right-hand side, it's just going to be showing what public schools are in the vicinity. This does not mean that whenever you guys are actually going to have somebody live in this property, that these are the schools that they're going to. It's just basing that on the location of the property. So still take this with a grain of salt. I mean, as much as you probably want to take the listing information with a grain of salt as well. But it's important as well that each of these schools actually is a clickable link. And when you click on that, it'll actually bring you to the school details for that particular area. And this shows us a report that we can create. So we can actually create a report just about this particular school. But it also shows us some basic information about, comparisons and ratings, what the ratings are for that area, what the teachers' ratings are. And there's also a little button down here at the bottom, see reviews on this school. Now, in case that just raised a gigantic red flag in your brain, you're probably perfectly justified in thinking that the reviews on the schools are actually things that are going to be presented by a variety of different sources, most often including the people that have actually gone to that school. You may notice that these reviews are a little bit more candid than you might want somebody to be on the uh, review of a school, because you'll get seniors who had a really bad experience with it, and then they end up writing a little soliloquy about how awful their time was there. Just be prepared for those kinds of statements. Again, this is all being funneled through a system called Niche, which allows us to keep track of the academic achievements of particular schools and how well they fare against other schools in the vicinity. You can see all of that basic information on here. But then that Niche website allows people to submit reviews as well. But for the most part, that grading system is going to be entirely outside of the reviews that have been left for the school. So just keep that in mind if you guys do end up having somebody who's like, well, the B plus or B minus, is that really that bad? And it's like, no, that's actually just referring to, how the school is performing relative to other schools in the vicinity. So anyway, whoa, that's obviously not accurate. That's pretty wild. Anyway, so I'm going to jump back to my property. There we go. Another thing that they've added, and this was actually, oof, I should have pulled up a different property. Another thing that they added recently was the AARP livability index. This is actually something that AARP added, I want to say last year, it might have been. Anyway, there's a little button over here to the right that says about this data. Now, this is going to be our first experience with seeing this, but if you guys are looking at the screen, we've got about this data on a whole bunch of other sections, which we're going to see a bunch of a little bit more later. This AARP livability index is something that they've actually created an algorithm that keeps track of a bunch of different sources of information to produce a number based on housing, neighborhood, transportation, etc. So if you guys do end up in a situation where somebody's moving to that area and they're just completely unfamiliar, you can kind of use this as a little bit of a lead in to what it's going to be like to actually live there. So for instance, I can't necessarily diagnose why this particular property has such a low score, but maybe there's not a hospital nearby. Maybe it's a relatively small community that has maybe less politicians that are representing it. I'm not actually really that sure. There's just a bunch of different, these numbers are actually lower than any others that I've seen, but I guess that's what I get for doing live data instead of finding specific properties. All right. Oh, this one's handy. It's actually got the information from the public records showing what the first floor and second floor contain as far as square footage. All right, so that's it for this property. Before we move on to our break, and then afterwards we're going to be doing the seller side of things, I'm going to click on this neighborhood tab next. Now, one of the things that they recently changed about this, which I truly appreciate, is that as we're going through a lot of this information, you're going to notice that it has effectively a breadcrumb trail up here at the top of the screen. So if I needed to jump back to the property I was just looking at, or if I needed to jump back into my search results, or even just jump back to actually redo my search because this is not the right area, but I want it to keep all the same specifications, all of that can be done using this breadcrumb trail. Now, another thing that they recently added is a nice big property button, so that if I wanted to just jump back to my property real quick, I can just do that from there. Back to my neighborhood. Excellent. Now, the neighborhood summaries are also going to be tied to a report. Now, the details that we see on here are going to be mostly focused on either a zip code. If this is a relatively populated area that has multiple zip codes, it's going to break it down by zip code, then city, then county, then state, then country. Other times you may end up just seeing it broken down by zip code, then county, state, country. But it's always going to try and provide you that extra context You'll see that for the summary page. You'll also see that for the housing page. It's going to break it down into statistics about how many people have what kind of properties, breaking it down again by the location, the county, city, or state, and country. So we can get some kind of context for what exactly is happening. We can also jump over to people. This is going to show us a demographic breakdown of what it's like or what the people are like in that particular area. And then we also have, I think some of this information actually does get filtered into the AARP livability index as far as the education section goes, just side note. We also have a section here for economy. This is especially important information if you guys have somebody who's moving into that area, or maybe as an investor and they kind of want to know what's happening in this area. That's rough. And then we also have the quality of life section. This is going to be more, this is the stuff that I'm always the most interested in, because anybody who lives here in Oklahoma knows the weather is wild. So I usually want to see what it's like to actually live in that particular area. So for instance, where I grew up in Littleton actually had 280 days of sunshine a year. It was absurd. So anytime I have any kind of inclement weather, I am very excited about it. Rainy days, cloudy days, whatever. But if that's a really important thing for me as a buyer, I might want to be able to see that information, and I can just hit this create report button to go run through that and send that off to the client that was interested. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the reports, as well as how to actually work with a seller when we get back from our break. So I'm going to put the video back on the screen, and I will see you guys back here in 10 minutes. It is currently 9:57, so I need everybody to be back at 9:07. I will be validating that you guys have returned, so please make sure to be back at that time. But I'm going to put the music back on. If you hear the music stop or see this video end, we're back to it. We're going to go ahead and get started again. All right, if you guys wouldn't mind, could you hit the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen? I just want to make sure everybody's back. We'll go ahead and get started again. And let's see, where did we leave off? So again, just hit that raise hand button down at the very bottom of your screen. Sarah and Sharon, I think, need to hit it still, but if you guys are having any issues or if it's not letting you hit the button or whatever, just let me know. Oh, perfect. All right, I just need to see Sharon's hand up and then we can go ahead. Oh, excellent. All right, everybody's up. All right. Thank you guys, I really appreciate it. Just for some context on why we're doing it that way, under normal circumstances, ORAC actually requires that we have everybody's videos on all the time so that I can see that you guys are still there and still watching, et cetera, et cetera. I don't particularly like that. I also feel like it's a lot more comfortable and casual environment if everybody just gets to participate rather than feeling like they have to get ready for their day in order to watch a webinar. So anyway, I appreciate you guys working with me on that. All right, so we're gonna jump back in and talk about creating a report. So before we get started with the seller side of things or looking at any other options, I'm just gonna grab a property. We're gonna go into the view full details. And from here, we're actually gonna start off with doing a report. Now, there's a couple different ways for us to actually get this arranged. So for instance, if we are looking at a specific thing, so for instance, if I had run the CMA or created the refined value option, any of those things will actually offer a report that's specific to that function. In my case, I'm actually just going to be doing it straight from the summary page. And what it's going to offer me is a property report. Now, the property report is actually a fairly comprehensive report. If you guys would like to see a preview of it, there's a view sample button, and it gives you a little bit of an overview. Go ahead and put this back in full screen. We don't need matrix anymore for now. This is actually going to show us just a little bit of a preview of what that report's actually going to look like. It allows us to see, whether or not there's certain portions of it that we actually want to include or not. You can actually stop the slideshow or skip to other slides, etc. But whenever we click on the view sample, it's showing just what the base options are going to be. So how large the report is going to be is actually going to be dependent on the property in question and the area that it's located in. But you also have the option to narrow down some of the pages by clicking this little plus arrow to the right of the report. And it brings up a variety of little checkboxes that allow us to find specific portions of the report that we actually want to include or not. So for instance, I've left off the AARP livability index. Maybe it wasn't particularly becoming of the area, or maybe it just didn't feel like it represented it very well. A little further down, I'm gonna uncheck the checkboxes for the neighborhood stuff. Maybe they already live in that neighborhood. They don't need to know any more information about it. So we can just choose to not include that since they're already there. But checking or unchecking these checkboxes will actually preserve that information. So if you do end up making selections and you actually like the way that those reports came out, you can just leave those checked or unchecked, and it'll always remember that the next time you get in there. So that school reviews, the AARP livability index, both of those were things that I had unchecked previously, and it just remembered that. Now, a little further down after we've chosen our report, there's going to be a way to personalize that report. We can put in a custom subject and a custom body, the content of the email itself. And then further down, we can either choose to display the information now, which would give me a PDF. I'm going to actually choose that option, or we can do an email option, which will include the rest of this information up at the top here. So I'm going to hit run report. What this does is it actually tells me I've got a property report generating for that particular property. So right up back at the top of the page here, I can see I've got a reports button. Now, the reports button is actually going to show me the breakdown of each of the different kinds of reports that we can create and which ones are actually either in creation or had been created in the last 24 hours. So you can see I've got my report being finalized here, and I've got a little number up here that's indicating I have a property report that's being created. If I'd started up a seller's report, I would see that there. If it was already finished, I would still see a number there, and I'll see that number until the end of the day. Ray asked, is this report for sellers? You can use it for sellers, for buyers, for your own personal edification. The report information is actually meant to be viewed by the public, so you don't have to worry about some of the restrictions that you might have to under normal circumstances where if you're looking at something in Matrix, it'll show like compensation information, it'll show the gate code if the broker put that in the broker remarks. Like there's a variety of different things that are not meant for public consumption. These reports that are being created are actually fully available to the public. So this is only going to be showing information that can be shown to anyone, MLS member, RPR, or our realtor, doesn't matter. It's just going to be publicly accessible reports. That's a good question. I also wanted to mention as well, there's a couple different ways for us to produce the reports for just a property in general. So if we're just looking for buyers, we also have a property flyer. This is just a one-page report. It just puts together a photo from the listing. It's got a map that shows where it is contextually, the basic details about the property, as well as my report finally finished, as well as showing the description and also my contact information. So for instance, if you guys were actually going to be going out with the buyer to look at a particular property, you can actually print one of these off and just carry it with you in case they want to maybe write some notes on the back or something like that. You also have a mini property report. The mini property report is going to be a little bit shorter version of this property report. You'll notice that it includes the main things that most of the clients are going to be interested in. It's just going to be a little bit more focused on just the property and just the details about the property. Whereas with the property report, you guys might notice that it's going to give us a lot more information on there. And then finally, we have the seller's report and the valuation workbook, both of which are related to running CMAs. Sorry about that. The seller's report and the valuation workbook, we're actually going to be looking at those in just a minute here. Not the valuation workbook directly, but whenever you're working with a seller, you can do a price valuation and give it. I'm so sorry, getting interrupted by my sneezes. We're going to work on creating a full seller's report in a minute here, so not to worry, we'll play with that in a bit. But my report finished, and you guys might have noticed that while I was doing something totally different in the system, it was actually giving me the notification that that report was done. Up here at the top of the screen, you can see this reports button, and I can again see that property report here. It's also going to show that information up here at the top. This was actually a recent addition that they made, so that whenever you get to the reports page, no matter whether you're looking at schools or neighborhoods or properties or whatever you're looking at, if you're looking at the reports page, it's going to show you any of the properties or reports that you've created recently. So I'm going to actually download this report. Let's take a look at what that property report created. Now, it shows us a nice big photo of the property in question. It's got the address up at the top there. If I scroll down, it'll show the context of the property. This just happens to be a relatively large one, so we don't get to see too many roads nearby. It shows our estimated value. You can choose to not include this if you would like. A little further down, it shows the basic specifications of the home. You can see the difference between what's the public records and what's the listing details. If we had added any further details, which is what we're actually going to be doing when we start working with the seller side of things, that information will all show up on here as well. So we can actually see not only the tax record information or what the listing had previously mentioned, but you're also going to add in any details that might be missing. So for instance, if we knew what the style of the property was, we can actually add that in there as a realtor. We've got some extended home facts, just giving some more details about the property. So similar to the way that Matrix has a lot of those pieces of information all gathered into one location, you can just quickly kind of jump through all of them and find out more about the construction, the fence, et cetera, et cetera. Now we get to our schools, the AARP Livability Index, which I added back on. We can see all of the photos for the property. Ooh, it's very pretty. Of course it is for that price. There's actually multiple listings worth of photos. It looks like this was listed multiple times. These historical photos are actually something that you may consider not including, primarily just because, you know, if it does turn out that the property has changed as dramatically as this one has, for instance, seeing all of those photos might not be beneficial. It might confuse the client. Comps and adjustments. This is going to show us any of the comparable properties. In this case, there are none because it's very unique, both in size and specifications. We can see our property history. Looks like somewhere in 2020, they decided to dramatically improve their house, which is why we can see the price jump from relatively small amount to what, quadruple, quintuple the size. Anyway, oh, here we go. You can actually see what the value was. Interesting. All right. There's also some interesting charts that they include. Again, this is something that you can choose whether or not you want to include this. One of the things that I actually really like about this section is the housing density, which I don't think actually shows up on the reports, but there's a feature on the map, which we'll discuss in a minute here, that allows us to actually witness the housing density for an area. So that way, if you have somebody like my wife, for instance, grew up in Stigler, and Stigler was dead quiet at night, like barely any cars driving around. There wasn't a highway anywhere nearby. Now we live in downtown Tulsa where there's a highway nearby and it's just obnoxiously noisy. So that housing density could be a good way to indicate to clients like whether or not there's a lot of noise or not a lot of traffic or all sorts of other different things. But we'll look at the map a little bit more later. Anyway, there's a bunch of different things on the report. I'm not going to try and go through all of them. What I would suggest you do is just find either a property that you're currently working with, so a listing that you currently have, or even just look up your own house. Just find out what the reports can produce. If anything, if you're looking up your own house, you'll be a lot more familiar with maybe the parts and pieces of your house, what it's actually showing since it's a neighborhood you live in. Can't stress enough how valuable it can be to just play in the system. The vast majority of the information that I have about this system wasn't something that I learned in class. It was just something that I learned when I was playing with the system, just trying to find out what I could do with it. So very strongly recommended that you guys just give it a try. But let's actually jump back to our homepage. Let's now talk about the maps. So before we get into the seller side of things, which is going to be a lot more focused on pricing and looking at off-market properties, let's actually jump up to the top here to research. We can see we can jump into a property search, a map search, a neighborhood search, or a school search. We can also check out what the market activity is like in an area, or even switch over to just seeing some commercial information. You'll notice that at the bottom of this, there is a how to research option. It's got a little play icon next to it because this is actually going to show us a video that they've put together that shows
RPR.
how all of the different functions work. This is a 2-minute, 15-second video. At the bottom of the marketing section, we also see a similar option, bottom of the reports button, and of course the learning section, which is actually going to be curated for whatever page we happen to be on. So for instance, if I do end up jumping into a specific property and I wanted to learn more about it, that Learn tab is actually going to change what is available there to show us what that property's property details page is going to look like, what pricing the property would look like. If we're looking at the neighborhood tab, it's going to show us a different selection of what the options are here. So this contextual learning option is one of the most valuable things that you guys have access to. but it's also going to have a bunch of those same buttons all over the place throughout the system. So like there's even a tour homepage button over here that allows you guys to kind of get your bearings on what's happening here on this homepage. But I'm going to click research and we're going to do map search. So from the map search, instead of choosing a specific location or putting in a bunch of details in advance, we actually have the option to just pull up the map and start drawing on it to find a specific area that we're interested in. So what I'm going to do is actually zoom this out and let's take a look over here next to Philbrook. That seems like a pretty part of town. So I'm going to click the draw option and I'm going to use the freehand tool. So I'm just going to grab this area over here. There we go. All right. So even just immediately after letting go, after dragging the line around, I have the option to search this area and it'll find any of the properties that match any of the specifications that I've already laid out up here at the top. So as you can see, we had a pretty dramatic difference between 5 properties for the entirety of Eufaula, and then with the same specifications, we've got a whole bunch here in Tulsa. I can actually see that information with the housing density option. So I mentioned that earlier, that whenever you guys are actually looking at the map, there's a bunch of different things we can add. So if I switch this over to housing density, you can see that there's a lot of properties that are in those areas. So there's probably a very valid reason why we actually see so many more properties there. We also can draw with a radius tool, a polygon tool, or a box. If you guys are unfamiliar with how any of these work, once you learn it for matrix or realist or RPR, you know the exact same function will work the exact same way when you guys get to a different system. So like for instance, the polygon tool allows me to just click, drop a corner, drop a corner, corner. There we go. So I can make a really strange shape if I wanted to, but instead of having to rely on my admittedly kind of shaky hand, I can actually draw that shape with a little bit more precision. We also have some cool drawing features, or excuse me, driving features. We've got a travel time, distance, or traffic counts. Like I mentioned before, if you guys have somebody who's a little bit more conscientious of the noise in a specific area, you can turn on the traffic counts, select all, apply, and you can see where the traffic is primarily going. So for instance, if I wanted to make sure that it was a little bit quieter, probably want to move towards where these little yellow icons are. Whereas any of these red icons, that might be a little bit noisy. Or in the case of Cherry Street up here, dangerous because people don't keep track of the pedestrians. Anyway, I'm going to remove that boundary. That kind of resets our search area. I'm just going to grab a box this time and we'll just do right here. If I don't like the shape that I've drawn, I can click the shape and hit edit and make some adjustments to it as well. All right, so I've got my shape, search. I can also add in points of interest. Points of interest will include pretty much all the basic things. I would strongly suggest if you guys do have clients that are interested in this stuff that you guys set that up for them. And there's also an option to print that if need be. Then finally, we also have the schools. So we can add in any public schools, private schools, charter schools, and we can choose between elementary, middle, and high school. And see where all of those are located. Right, remove boundaries. And then finally on this data layer option, the one thing that everybody always seems to be interested in is flood zones, adding in those flood zones. Now, one of the important things to recognize about how the flood zones are popping up, clear this off. The flood zones are actually going to be showing just a general piece of information and not the kind of specificity that you would get if you were, I don't know, looking this up in Realist or Matrix. Realist and Matrix are actually going to be using the exact same codes and coloring that FEMA uses, whereas with RPR, they're actually trying to give you kind of that generalized view. So the flood zones in this case are just referring to low risk to high risk, rather than actually referring to, all right, this area here is actually not in a flood zone. This area here is in a 500-year flood plain. This area here is in a 100-year flood way, or whatever the designation happens to be. So all of those little kind of subtle things are a little bit lost whenever you guys are doing it in RPR. But it also means that that way you don't have to answer questions about, well, what does this X500 mean on the map? Well, that X500 is referring to the 500-year flood plain. The X100 is the flood way, whatever the case may be. So it at least alleviates some of the stress on your side that you're not going to have to worry about explaining what a coastal flood zone is or something like that. All right, clear that off. There are a bunch of other options on here. I can't stress enough how valuable these could be to take a look at. I just like playing with the map. It's just one of the things that I think is really cool about RPR. But finally, we also have a legend as well. This way you guys can actually check in on what each of these little symbols mean. So for instance, these ones that have a black dot around them, that's indicating that it's for sale currently. All right. Finally, we do have a couple options to either center us into a specific location. So for instance, if I had drawn a specific area and then I was moving away from it, I can hit that recenter. Oops. Oh, I forgot to hit the search function first. Zoom back out. I'm familiar. Search this area. So if I end up running a search in a specific spot and then navigating away from it, I can hit that recenter button and it'll zoom me back over to where it was that I originally was. There's also a full screen option, so that you're going to have the map take up the entirety of the screen rather than just being a small window within a small window. All right, so that's it for our map. It's 10:30, perfect. All right, I'm going to jump back over to our homepage and let's now talk about our sellers. Now, the sellers side of things is going to be a little bit different. Most of what we've been working with so far has all been listed properties. So in our case, we're actually going to be discussing a property that we're going to list. And in this case, it's going to be a property that I happen to live near. There we go. So notice in this case, I actually put in a specific address. It gave me the option to just effectively pull that information up. And subsequently, here we are with the property. This just happens to be in the neighborhood near me. So, all right. So on here, what we can see is we've actually got the basic details about the property. All of this information is at the moment coming over from just the public records. Now, this is not showing some of the details that might have been listed on a previous listing because that listing was so long ago that it can't necessarily trust that it's still relevant. It's going to be, I want to say it's 5 years back. It may actually be a shorter time frame than that now, but anyway. So if we do find that, now that we've started talking to them and it looks like we're discussing things with Vex properties, they're wanting to offload this or whatever, I can scroll down here and start putting in some changes. So while I'm discussing things with them, I could say, okay, well, how many bedrooms are there? Oh, there's 3. Okay. How many total bathrooms are there? Sure, there's actually 1 full bath and 1 half bath. A little further down, we can adjust the living square footage. So for instance, if they decided to add on to the back of the house or the top of the house or put in a second floor or add something in the back of the building, whatever, you can just go ahead and add that in there. Whatever. It's also important to note that if the information that's actually found on here doesn't include everything that you would like to document, you can always add another row and choose either from some of the things that they currently have available, or you can just type something in. So for instance, if you guys wanted to use mature trees, there we go. Yes. Or we can do add another row, and we can actually add in any custom facts that we want. So if there is anything that we wanted to like add in from another page or another listing or something that we just constantly keep track of, I can add that in as a custom fact. All right. Now, once I've gotten some of those basic things documented, I might want to come back up here and start working with the pricing of this property. Now, in this case, it looks like the RVM has actually already provided me with a number that's almost in line with what I was thinking about selling the property for. But in my case, I actually wanted to work a little bit with this estimate to see if I can try and improve that. If that doesn't end up working, I do have the fallback of actually just creating a full-on CMA. So we're going to discuss that afterwards. But let's say that I do end up wanting to run with this particular number. I can go to refine value. I can see the property type is clarified. It's like I need to put in the bedroom count. So let's say 3. And I was like, why is this not showing the information that I had from before? And it's because I didn't save it on the last page. That's my mistake. Whatever. All right, I can hit apply. Watch what ends up happening as soon as I end up adding in at a little bit extra space and even clarifying the bedroom count. It automatically adds in a certain value for the particular property. So in this case, it's actually trying to measure, all right, all of the other properties that are in this particular zip code, they have, X amount of space, they have Y amount of bedrooms, they have Z amount of bathrooms. I'm going to take an algorithm and find out what each and every part and piece of those properties is worth, and then subsequently create an estimate that I can then use on this particular property. So whenever I increase the value or increase the number on bedrooms or living square footage, it automatically knows, all right, well, the extra square feet that you added is worth X amount of money. So it provides us that estimate here. Now we can always reset this and it'll bring it back to all the same things that were found on that initial public tax record. But in my case, this is fine. I hit apply. So it adds in about $30,000 extra dollars. Now, the refined value by needed improvements, this is where we're going to actually start quoting in some of the things that they, thought that I skipped a section. I apologize. Refined value by home improvements. This is where we can actually document any of the major changes that they've done. So in this case, maybe he did a kitchen remodel and they did that in February of 2020, or let's say June. So this was their quarantine project. Let's say that they ended up spending $15,000 on it. When I click add, you notice that it actually doesn't give us that $15,000. It says this is how much the value is after depreciation. This is a great way to kind of get a third-party opinion on what the added value is of any of the changes that somebody's made to a property. This might be something important to reinforce for people that are coming in with the expectation that, well, we spent $20,000 on this property. I expect the value of the property to be $20,000 more than it is. No, it's unfortunately not how things work. So we can see that this almost cut the value in half, even though that was just a couple of years ago. We also have a section here for needed improvements. So in this case, let's say that ventilation needs to be replaced. And we know that that's going to end up costing them $2,000. Maybe I've got a buddy that gave me an estimate on that, or however you guys need to do that. Just make sure that you guys are perfectly accurate with this on what the estimate should be. Because when you click add, you notice how this one doesn't do a depreciation on the value. So this is just going to be a flat reduction in price based on whatever the value was that you provided here. So if you do end up in a situation where maybe a client's not willing to make an adjustment to the property, like they expect the buyer to have to go through the process of replacing the fence or doing the ventilations, whatever the case may be, you can just mention that on here as just a flat deduction in value and say, look, if you're not making that change, the buyer's going to have to do it. You should take that value off the property. So this is, again, something that you can include on reports. If it does end up kind of being a point of contention, you can at least cite that that's part of your job. But anyway, a little further down, we have our refined value section. This is where we can actually give a little bit more of a subjective view of things. Now, my perspective is on this, that whenever you guys are working with this refined value with the sliders, try and make it so that you can see the value that you're changing it by down here at the very bottom of the screen. Because if I have a specific number in mind, so like let's say that my client's got 170,000, I wanted to get this to actually be around 160,000. So I needed to somehow deduct $9,000 just to make sure that, all right, yeah, you did some nice improvements. we got some repairs that are needed, but I also want to make sure that you don't have some self-aggrandizing value of your property that you're going to get, $200,000 out of this. All right, so the local market conditions, yeah, they might be a little bit hot, sure. But see, as soon as I start sliding this over, it's starting to add value to this property. So maybe I want to leave that. Home exterior condition, maybe it's not particularly great, so I'm going to dip that down. Home interior condition is really not great, so I'm going to dip that down. Maybe the lot size is nice, but it's also shared with a house on the back. The view, it's actually pretty nice, but the privacy is abysmal. Maybe it's right across the street from a Dollar General. So you can slide these all around until you kind of get roughly what you want from this number. Just be prepared if you guys do end up using this section, which I should point out is not required. If you do end up using that section, be prepared to justify your sliders, because a client might end up coming up with some very targeted questions about why is it that you said that the market conditions weren't hot, but you said that the exterior was bad, the view was great, the privacy was bad, whatever. Because if you do end up making any changes to those, someone somewhere is probably going to ask why. Anyway, all right, so that's it for our refined value. If I do end up hitting create report from here, it's actually just going to bring me to the basic property report. Because the idea is that whenever you guys produce that property report, what it's actually trying to show, I didn't leave it open, hold on. What it's actually trying to show with that estimated value is effectively just a number that you've come up with or the system has come up with. In this case, the system came up with this 2 million, and then any adjustments that I would have made are going to appear over here. So if I were to create the property report for this particular property, am I still on the right property? I am not. There we go, that's what we needed. I can hit run report. And again, it remembers all my settings, so I don't have to go through and verify that all of that is correct again. So with that, that'll be running in the background. Let's go ahead and start working now back on the property with the CMA side. So again, I had a specific targeted number that I was aiming for. So I'm going to hit create CMA. And then from here, we can see either a comparative analysis or a sales comparison analysis. The gist of this boils down to the comparative analysis is actually a little bit more focused on just the finding them of the properties and getting a value based on the average or median of those. The sales comparison analysis is going to add a whole lot more nuance. There's one caveat with that. The sales comparison analysis is going to require you guys to give exact numbers for each of the values of the property, or each of the attributes of the property. So for instance, if you have a property that has way more square footage that you found as a comparable, you're going to have to give the value estimate of what that square footage causes to the price of that property. So there is a handy dandy video that's actually attached here. So under what's the difference, you guys can see that there's
a sales comparison analysis feature is a simple.
It'll give you guys a little bit of an overview of that. It's only a couple minutes long, so it's very quick and simple, but that way you guys can learn the difference between the two. But suffice to say, if you guys are actually really competent with providing estimates, or maybe you have some experience with appraisals, or you have access to somebody who does appraisals, you can use that sales comparison analysis. But for today, I'm just going to do the comparative analysis. So home facts, the first thing I need to verify is to make sure that I have all of the correct information. So in my case, I got the bedrooms, that's been updated. So you can see that that's been highlighted. And then we also have the full bath, partial bath, and of course the living square footage. So I'm happy with all of that. The rest of it looks correct. Save that. And now we're going to be on to step 2, which is finding the comparable properties. Now, finding comparable properties is just going to be like any other system that we use. It's important to note that whenever you guys are going through in Matrix, there's some basic guidelines that you should follow in regards to making sure that you're actually searching for the kind of properties that you need, always making sure that you follow some of the basic guidelines of like looking within the area of the property, as well as making sure that you're seeing any of the active, pending, and closed listings. And then we also want to make sure that we're only seeing the information that's relevant for this market. Now, all of that to say, if you guys have any experience with the CMAs or have been through our CMA class, some of this is going to seem like a little bit of a rehash, but for those of you guys who are new, what CMAs boil down to is trying to get a big picture of a small area. So we're trying to find out what's happening in this particular area and which properties are for sale, what they're like, what their specifications are, what their pricing is, etc. Now, when we're looking for those properties, the status is one of the main things that we actually need to keep track of. We need to find only the properties that are currently active, pending, or closed. We can include other options as well, but sometimes it might be for more of a specific situation. So the example I like to share is the expired listings. I always try and relate this to the vowels A, E, I, O, U, and then sometimes expired. Because the sometimes expired is going to be more beneficial for those of you who have a client that might have overvalued their property. So for instance, if somebody has come into the situation with some Zillow Zestimate in hand and they're like, well, my property is actually worth, $250,000, and you're looking at this property that's barely worth 130, and you're like, I don't think that's going to be accurate. You can use that expired listings to allow us to see any of the listings that did not make it. And we can show, all right, maybe this house is not nice, but you live in this area, you know what this house looks like. What does it look like? Is it in a dilapidated state? Is it unlivable? Oh no, it's a perfectly nice house and they valued it at $200,000 and lo and behold, it didn't sell and then again, expired. That might be a good indication to your seller. Maybe we should try and work towards a different pricing option. So just something valuable to keep in mind. It's not something that's required. But then we also want to make sure that we're working with a specific time frame that's going to be relevant for this particular market. Now, no other time in real estate history has been quite as wild as the 2020 and 2021 was. So I couldn't stress this enough all the time that I was teaching during that time frame, but even still, the market is kind of wild. So what I would recommend that you guys keep in mind is 6 months is probably where you want to stop. If you're working in an area that has not too much housing density, or maybe there's not too many properties nearby, or maybe even just not too many properties that are the same specifications as the property you're working with, you can increase this. In fact, RPR actually allows you to go beyond even just some of the shorter options. It allows you to go up to 1.5 years back. Now, I don't think that's a good idea. In fact, we actually recommend to people a hard limit of 1 year. So like the recommended limit is 6 months. Hard limit is 1 year, because if you go more than 1 year back, it's pretty likely that the market has changed dramatically since then. But if you guys are working in an area where there's just not a lot of activity, or again, you're working with a property that's pretty unique, trying to find comparables can be next to impossible if you limit yourself to just what's sold recently. So you can expand that out. I'm going to leave mine on the last 6 months. And I'm going to scroll down here to bed, bath, etc. You can add in some maxes to these if you need to, but it's going to try and find properties that are pretty close to what I'm working with. Now, oddly enough, and this is something that I'm not particularly fond of, but if you guys would like to use it, you can. There is actually a price range option. I mentioned an example that was similar to this a little bit earlier. If you guys are working with lakefront properties, for instance, those lakefront properties might actually have a pretty dramatically different price than even a property next door that's in the exact same neighborhood, but just doesn't have access to the water. So in situations like that, I mean, it might be a little bit difficult to actually clarify that. You may end up wanting to like draw a shape around things, but even then, if there's any overlap in a specific drawing that you've added on there that accidentally grabs in a different property, it might find an exact match for the square footage, the bedrooms, the bathrooms, etc. but it's, half a mile away or next door, and it's a completely different price. So in the situation of using the price range, I would recommend to people typically not to use that at all, because that could artificially limit your results and subsequently dramatically influence the price that you're going to give to your client. But it is there if you guys need it. And that's a perfect example of when to use it. It's just if you have somebody that's got a property that's very unique, hit that price range option and narrow down your price range a little bit. That way you're not seeing things that are too dissimilar. And then finally, we have a year built and a keywords option. I don't think too many people are using these, but it might be beneficial just to make sure that, if there was newer things that were added, it automatically put in 1950 since this was built about 24 years before that. So I can check that and run my search. All right. So again, what this is showing me is only going to be the results for within that area. Now, interestingly enough, it looks like a lot of the properties that it found are actually things that are pretty far away. Now, I wanted to mention when you guys are running your search in RPR, it's actually going to be searching based on the area that you're zoomed into. So for instance, if I wanted to get rid of some of these results, I can either zoom in and make sure that I'm only seeing those properties there, or I can hit draw a shape and draw a box around the area that I specifically want to search. So search in this area. Oh, looks like I can't find anything. So now I'm going to have to go back to modify search, find out maybe what might have sold in the last 12 months. Maybe I want to uncheck this year built option. And looks like I'm still not finding any comps. Now, this is something that happens every once in a while. Just happens to be that. Let's see if there's anything expired. Interesting. Let's expand this out a little bit. This neighborhood nearby is actually pretty similar, so we'll do that area. All right. So I'm going to search in this area. Hey, there we go. Oh, perfect. Oh my goodness, is that property still for sale? Oh, okay. There was a building over in this neighborhood because my wife and I used to take walks over here with that little bike trail there. There was a house that was in complete disarray that was being sold as is. I was just wondering if that's the one. It's not. Anyway, I found some comparables. I can scroll down here and see, okay, it looks like these are a bunch of properties that were built around the same time. They just happen to be a little bit closer to the highway. I'm going to add all of those onto my comp list just by checking that checkbox. And then that way I can actually see what the pricing looks like by comparison to my property. Now, an important note about whenever you guys are looking at these comparables that it found is that there's going to be some that actually come including this little star icon. What that's telling us is that this was actually a property that not only did we think is actually accurate, so I'm checked the checkbox on it, found it as a comp, etc., but the system also thought that this was a similar enough property that whenever it was coming up with our automated price, so remember that RVM that we were looking at earlier, this was actually one of the properties that it used to judge that price. So if you guys ever see that, that's a pretty good vote of confidence that you found a comparable that's worthwhile. But these other two look like they're going to be good. That one's got the same amount of bedrooms, bathrooms. This one's also got the same amount of bedrooms, different bathrooms. That's okay. Update valuation and close will move me on to the next step. So from here, we have the option to make adjustments to the properties. This is something that I would do with a little bit of hesitancy. The reason why I say that is because, again, it's back to this slider option. So you're going to have to aim for a specific value that you want to decrease this by or increase this by. Now, it's important to note when we're messing with these sliders, again, something that I wouldn't necessarily recommend, but it's available, is if you guys end up moving this slider up and saying that this property was better, what this is actually doing is actually decreasing not the value of this particular property, but it's actually decreasing the estimate that my property has. So if I end up saying that this property was way worse and it had a higher value, it's actually going to be adding value to my property. So same thing goes with this one. If I say that this one was way better, this one was way better, and this one was way worse, notice what it's doing is it's taking away, and then adding. So if you have a specific price range in mind, aim for that with these sliders. But again, otherwise, it's very subjective. Putting that information in there for your clients to be able to see is kind of inviting a conversation about why it was that you ended up choosing that value. Anyway, next we've got our review comp analysis. So again, just to do a quick recap, we chose comparative analysis, we verified the facts of the property, we found the comparable properties. All of that's going to be pretty similar to what we do in Matrix. But now we get down to this review comp analysis, where we can actually take the value that it provided to us, and I can go back and make some adjustments to this. So if I wanted to say 220, and we'll do, 200 to 240. There we go, save. So whenever I present this to my client, this is actually the numbers that it's going to show. Now, once we've completed all of those other steps, I can hit create report. And just like it did when we were in the neighborhoods and it created a neighborhood report, or we're looking at the property details and it tried to create a property report, when we're doing the CMA, if I hit that create report button, it's just going to automatically bring me to the seller's report. The seller's report is, if you guys notice here, the largest of all the reports that we have available in RPR, and for very good reason. When I click on view sample here, I can see that it's got pretty much the same basic information that we normally had. But when we get a little bit further on in here, we're actually going to see that it's going to show us all of the comparables side by side. So we can actually take a look at each of the individual properties and find out what each of them looks like, what their description is, what their specifications are. And then it'll also break that down into full property sheets so that we can actually learn more about the property if we needed to. So again, tons of information, lots of details about the properties in question. And this is part of the reason why we end up having such a large report. Now, in my case, since I'm working with a property that's small value, small amount of comparables, it's not going to end up being that full 81 pages. But if I wanted to narrow this down even further, I do have some options down here at the bottom to make sure that I'm only seeing things that are relevant to my client. So for instance, market activity might not be beneficial to them. So I'm just going to take all of that off. And I can see down here the recommended pricing strategy includes both my refined value calculation as well as my comp analysis calculation. If I didn't want to include one or the other, I can uncheck those. So for instance, if my refined value calculation was just way off, or if my comp analysis didn't end up finding anything because there was hardly any properties in the area, that's fine. I can just hit run report. And when it creates that report, it's actually going to provide me with just the information that my client will be interested in. So I really like the report functionality. Again, I can't stress enough just playing with it. One of the things that I wanted to mention, especially now that we're in the last couple of minutes here, RPR is actually one of the few systems that I've never had crash on me. I would strongly recommend that you guys just play with it. There's no way that you guys are going to break it. If you do, I'd be impressed. Please let us know. I just want to know how you did it, because I haven't been able to. I like testing that way. So whenever the seller's report pops up, I'm going to do a quick review of it. But just a quick recap, since we're nearing the end here, and I want to make sure that you guys are equipped to be able to empower yourself later. Whenever you guys first land, after you get registered and signed in, there's going to be that learn option up at the top. That's going to be learning for whatever page you happen to be on. So no matter what you guys find yourself doing, if you don't feel comfortable with it, or if you don't feel familiar with it, click on that learn option and you'll see a curated list of all of the functionality for that particular page. And then also, we've got our help section. This is where you guys can find a 24/7 phone number. We also have a live chat, which I've pretty much only been using ever since they started offering it. I like the phone service. It's very quick. I don't know that I've ever actually been on hold for very long, if at all. But the live chat with member support is phenomenal. Anytime I have a quick question, or maybe there's a property that's not mapped correctly, or some of the listing data didn't come over correctly and needs to get updated, I can hit that live chat option to get that ready. Additionally, under the help section, there's also a training area. I can't stress how useful this training area is. It has things broken down by ebooks, little printable things that you guys can just kind of grab and go. They've got tutorial videos, they've got webinars, they've got everything broken down by specific categories. For those of you guys who are interested in RPR mobile, they have 2 different things for that, both of which are webinars that are just, I can't stress enough. The RPR app on your phone is, no hyperbole at all in this situation, the best app that you guys have access to as realtors. It's extremely easy to use. It offers you an immense wealth of information about, again, every property in the entire country. And let's say that you guys are out on the road and you're talking to a client. They point at a property across the street from some property that you're showing. It's got a sign in the yard. It's got a listing in the system. I can just immediately open up my app and send them some 70-page report while we're sitting in the car. So it's phenomenally useful. I can't stress enough how much that helps everybody that's using it. So we do mention that in our mobile agent class. So if you guys are interested in learning more about the RPR app, check out our mobile agent class that we offer, which I think we have coming up soon. Nope, that's not it. Not this month, but next month we will have the mobile agent class. But either way, my final report popped up. So I'm going to open up that seller's report and let's take a look at it. But officially speaking, we are done with class. If everybody could give me one last wave, just hit that raise hand button down at the bottom. And we will see you guys later. Again, I'm going to run through this, and it looks like I got another question to answer, but if you guys would like to stick around just to see what this report looks like or ask any further questions, just let me know. We'll leave the session running for a little bit. Ray asked, does the suggested seller's verbiage in their email change as opposed to the buyer's email? No, actually, coincidentally, all of the reports are pretty much just going to produce the same information no matter who they're being produced for. The seller's report is just a little bit more explicit about, this is your property, this is your neighborhood, this is your information. So for instance, that change that I made, the refinements that I made to the value of the property based on this is not being included because I didn't include that checkbox. The comp analysis side of things is the side that I did customize, and this is the value that I produced from that number. So remember, I did customize this number so that it was just the whole number. Same thing with this one. So, oh, and actually, I've mentioned this before, but just as a reminder, if you guys do end up making adjustments to the refined value, and you don't want to have to explain why it was that you chose the specific sliders up or down, you might not want to include this checkbox whenever you produce your report. That's actually going to be under this section here, refined value calculation. Oh, and Sharon, we did actually have a 3-hour version of this class. The latter portion of it was actually going over the mobile app, which I really liked. But yeah, once we start doing the in-person class, or well, actually this month we're starting the in-person classes again. But once we've got that back in full swing, we might go back to doing some of the 3-hour long classes. But already kind of taking a risk with the current COVID situation, so we're trying to avoid having the really particularly long classes. But I'm just glad we're finally at least seeing numbers that are making it relatively safe. anyway, yeah. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. So just as a reminder, if you do end up having any questions about RPR, you can call us, but I would strongly recommend that you guys reach out to them directly. Everybody on our team actually is familiar enough with the product to get you through some of the basic information, or at least present, some of the alternatives to the systems that we currently use. But if you guys are really interested in learning a lot more about it, reach out to them. They're phenomenal. I really love working with them. But should be set. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. Since it doesn't look like we have any other questions, I'm going to go ahead and close up shop. In the interim, just stay safe. Enjoy whatever nice weather we end up having. And I will see you guys in the future.